Hello, geographers, and welcome to another amazing lesson about climate change. Now, the topic is how can we reduce the impacts of climate change? However, I want to make a point here. The textbook is wrong to call it how can we reduce the impacts of climate change because it's just actually about how can we reduce climate change. Again, reducing the impacts of climate change would be something completely different. Reducing the impacts of climate change would be to say, okay, climate change is happening. What are we going to do to deal with it now that it's already here? And that would be take care of people who can't afford increased energy bills because they're going to have to use their air conditioning more often, or have drought-resistant crops, or have dams to stop sea level rise. Yeah, that's reducing the impacts of climate change when it already exists. Very different to how to reduce climate change in the first place, okay? So even though the title of this is how to reduce the impacts, it's actually just how to reduce climate change. They are different things, so don't get confused. And I hope I haven't added to that. Okay, some learning goals. Please write these down. You're going to know what different types of energy are available. You're going to know ways to reduce carbon emissions, just like we looked at last time. So a little bit of repetition there. That's life. Okay, fossil fuels. These are fuels made from fossils. So hundreds of millions of years ago, trees died, went flat, got squashed by heaps and heaps and heaps and heaps and heaps of more land, and eventually turned into coal and oil. And then we burn them. Okay, so coal, oil, and natural gas are fossil fuels. Fossil fuels create most of our electricity at the moment. In Australia, at the time of filming this video, Australia's #1 source of electricity was burning coal. Disgusting, but true. Here's a look at electricity generation across Australia. So there you go. 73% of it is generated from burning electricity. Now this graph is actually about 5 years old, but it's probably not that much different to now. So 13% from natural gas. We'll get a little bit of hydro there, a little bit of wind, rooftop solar. Yay! I'm contributing to that. And a little bit of bioenergy, whatever that is. Now we can make energy from burning fossil fuels, but we don't have to. We could make it using renewable sources. So there are lots of ways to make electricity without those fossil fuels, such as solar panels. Now everybody will say, solar panels, what about at night? Sun doesn't glow, doesn't shine at night, and so there's no power. Yes, well, now you store that energy that you created in the daytime in a battery, and then the battery powers you at night. This is what happened, incidentally, in South Australia. Elon Musk, that famous but quite nuts billionaire, put a challenge out to the Premier of South Australia and said, we'll build you the world's biggest solar array with batteries, and we'll do it in 100 days or it's free. And he went, yeah, okay. And Elon Musk did it in the 100 days. And so now South Australia has got a really big solar grid with batteries, which means that when the sun's shining, the batteries charge up. And then when the sun's not shining, the batteries get used. And so you do get this continuous form of energy, which has always been a big concern. People who are like, renewable energy, what about when it's cloudy or when it's not windy? Well, the answer to all of those naysayers is batteries. You charge them up, and then when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, you use the power that's in the batteries. Wind turbines, not windmills. Despite what Donald Trump might say, wind turbines, they're quite different, way bigger. We can also make it from waves and tides. If you put the equivalent of a wind turbine underwater, as the waves and tide go in and out, it turns the turbine, thus creating electricity. And geothermal energy. Now, we don't have a lot of this in Australia, but it can be done. There's heaps in Iceland, there's a little bit in New Zealand as well. That's heat that comes out of the ground in certain places, yeah. I've been to a stream in New Zealand that's as hot as a bath. You can just chill out in that stream and the water is boiling hot. Not boiling hot, but hot. Bath hot. Right, so here's a few different ways of getting renewable energy. You've got your wind power, geothermal, solar, hydro, and then there's another one. Oh, there you go, biofuel. So that's from turning organic mass into fuel. And you can actually see that at the petrol station. It's called E10, which means that 10% of the petrol is made from ethanol, which is made from corn and a variety of other plants. Now, biofuels are a little bit controversial because quite a few of the places where they grow the plants to turn into biofuels, they actually cut down native forests to do it. And if you do end up watching Before the Flood, the environmental documentary narrated by Leonardo DiCaprio, you'll see in Indonesia they burn down heaps of jungle to plant crops that are used for biofuel. So in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, biofuels are not a great method, especially when we've got all these other ones. I mean, the advantage of biofuel is that you can add it to existing petrol and you don't have to get a different car. Anyway, so here's an example of one country that is going to they hope, have 100% renewable energy by 2050, the Netherlands in Europe. And if you have a look, they're going to get 60% of it from offshore wind. That's putting wind turbines out to sea, so they're not underwater. They're above water, but because they're out to sea, they don't make lots of wind and they don't use up any land. So offshore wind's a really awesome option. And then most of the rest of it's going to come from solar energy. There are some other countries that already have 100%, and some days, depending on the sun and the wind, more than 100% of their electricity from renewables, such as Denmark. Some days Denmark generates 120% of its energy from renewables. 120%, you say? That's not possible. Well, it is, because they send the other 20% to surrounding countries and sell it to them. Which is, interesting. There is quite a good argument to say that there's a big economic opportunity in renewable energy. Australia is the sunniest place on earth. Why don't we generate wads of solar energy and sell it? Who knows? I think we should. So what about the future? How should we reduce our carbon footprint with energy use in the future? And in 2007, the United Nations suggested these areas for reducing greenhouse gas pollution. 1. Energy supply. So we should use gas instead of coal. Now, obviously gas is still a fossil fuel, but it pollutes way less than coal, so it's not perfect, but it's better. Use nuclear power. Now, because there's been a few incidents of nuclear reactor explosions, like Chernobyl in the 80s, 3 Mile Island in the US, and a little bit in Fukushima, people are freaking out, thinking that nuclear power is unsafe. It's actually very, very safe. If you compare the amount of deaths that are caused by coal from air pollution, forget climate change for a second, just the air pollution that comes out of a coal-fired power plant, like the particles that goes into people's lungs and gives them lung disease and they die, is heaps compared to, the tiny number of nuclear accidents that haven't really resulted in many deaths. Now, this is just my opinion, of course. There is also the problem that nuclear power, the fuel rods used in nuclear power can be used for nuclear weapons, which is bad, because nuclear weapons could destroy all life on Earth. The reason why some people think that nuclear power is a good idea is because it is something that could produce a huge amount of energy, and those power plants could be set up quite quickly. So that's just something to think about. Transport, we should use more electric cars. It's beginning in Australia, but hasn't really caught on. A lot of the big car companies in Europe and around the world have said that by 2030 or 2050 they are not going to be making any more petrol-powered cars. So there is going to be a future out there when only electric cars are being produced. However, just because the car companies aren't producing new petrol-powered cars, it doesn't mean that there won't still be heaps on the road. It's not like all the cars on the road now were only made in the last couple of years, so there'll still be lots of petrol-powered cars out into the future. But that's one of the suggestions. We should use more efficient lights and heaters in our buildings. We should recycle building material. Heaps of building material goes into landfill rather than being reused. Just to give you one example, concrete is a very carbon intensive. Producing concrete is very carbon intensive, and so if we could reuse concrete rather than making it from scratch every time we knock down a building and put another one in the same place, that'd be good for pollution. Agriculture, we should restore polluted soil. So a lot of our farming isn't sustainable because we're taking too much out of the soil without putting the nutrients back in the soil. We should plant new forests, as mentioned. That to me just seems a no-brainer. Incidentally, the Labour government that got in New Zealand 3 years ago had a policy that they were going to plant 1 billion trees. And they've planted tens of millions so far, so we see how they go. And finally, again, as I mentioned in our last lesson, composting. Remember, 40% of waste in the typical red bin, if you don't compost, is organic matter, and you could compost it, which recycles it on site. Doesn't need to be driven around. You literally just dig a hole in the ground, chuck all your food scraps in there. Hey presto, new soil 6 months later. So here we've got a thing from a company called Advancing Net Zero. It's a World Green Building Council global project, and it has the goal of making buildings carbon neutral. By carbon neutral, we mean they don't produce carbon, right? Because you think about it, cities are where the majority of people live in the world now, and more people are moving to cities. So what are cities made of? They're made of buildings. So if we could make buildings carbon neutral or net zero carbon buildings, then that would be really good. And here are the strategies that they are suggesting to get there. This one is very interesting. It's how Americans are trying to curb their carbon emissions. To have a look at the kinds of things they're doing: buying higher efficiency appliances, buying insulation for their home, planting trees, that's nice, mass transit, buying a smaller car, yada yada yada. Now, the reason why I'm saying buying is because I want to point out something here. Humans seem to think that we can buy our way out of all problems, right? If everybody in the world used as much energy as, say, a poor farmer in China, then we probably wouldn't have a big climate change problem. The fact of the matter is the rich Western countries use heaps of resources, and we really don't seem to want to reduce anything. We just want to buy our way out of it. So, okay, how do I reduce energy use in my house? I'll buy a new thing that's more energy efficient. That's good, don't get me wrong, but it's just buying another thing rather than saying I'm going to reduce the use of something or live with less. It's more of a psychological step that humans at the moment don't seem to be able to want to take. Okay, here's a really interesting slide. This is talking about how much carbon we can still afford to emit if we don't want to see the average temperature increase too much. Okay, right, so let's start off with 1 degree. 1 degree, that's already happened. We're already 1 degree hotter than it would have been if we hadn't gone through the Industrial Revolution, right? Now, what do we need to do to make sure it doesn't go any above 2 degrees? Remember, that was what was agreed upon at the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Scientists estimate that roughly 1,100 gigatons is how much carbon would get us to 2 degrees, okay? So, not even. If we pump out 1,100 gigatons, we've got a 2/3, 67% chance of keeping global temperature rise within 2 degrees. They've got to give chances here because climate science is not exact. Now, we pump out 46 gigatons per year. So in 24 years, pumping out 46 gigatons, that would be our entire budget. We would be at 2 degrees. So the question is, how are we going to get out? Like, if we don't get it down below that, then we're going to go to 2 degrees. And if we continue to pollute, it's just going to keep going up and up. And if you have a look here, what happens when the temperature gets to 3 degrees on average hotter? Great Barrier Reef. See ya! Murray-Darling Basin, food production reduced by half. Bye! 3 times the extreme fire days. Dole! and lots of temperature-related deaths. We're already starting to see huge numbers of deaths in Europe from heat waves. Australia is the hottest continent on Earth, so it's something that we should be concerned about. Okay, the activity today is a revision quiz looking at all of the material that we've looked at in this unit so far. So I want you to go here, bit.ly/climate quiz 2020. Keep doing that quiz until you can get 100%. I do receive your names, so I will know whether or not you've done this or not. So just keep doing that quiz as many times as you need to until you can get 100%. It's not too hard. You know, once you can get 100% on that, then you've demonstrated that you have remembered a lot of the important material from this unit, and that's a good thing. Yeah. Time to watch some videos. This one's called Smart Climate Change Adaptation in Practice, and it's from the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Essentially, it's just a club for rich countries. Take it away.
It's no longer just polar bears who are feeling the effects of climate change. Fierce storms, unseasonal heat waves, and rising sea levels are starting to affect us all. And yet, people and assets are being concentrated in hazard-prone areas. In 2013, weather and climate-related disasters led to 19,000 deaths and $125 billion of economic losses. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a must. But governments, businesses, and communities also need to prepare for a changing climate. But what does this look like in practice? Copenhagen is creating new green spaces and waterways to deal with cloudbursts that can dump 15 centimeters of rain in just 2 hours. This reduces the need for expensive drainage upgrades while providing space for recreation and nature. In Toronto, new large buildings are required to have green roofs. These help to keep the city cool during the summer, with a 5 to 15% reduction in electricity use while keeping buildings warm during the winter. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth, so every drop of water counts. Sydney residents are saving around 19 billion litres of drinking water each year thanks to changes in their behaviour, such as watering their lawns during the evening. In Japan, Yokohama faces the opposite challenge of having too much water. They have built a 70,000-seat stadium on stilts to provide space for excess water to go. Mexico is using nature itself to protect water supplies. Farmers are rewarded for preserving forest cover, helping to protect downstream water supplies while also preserving biodiversity. The OECD supports countries' preparations for climate change by bringing public and private actors together, providing analysis and policy advice for adaptation. Working together, we aim to support smart action to tackle climate change.
Our second video for today is called Climate Change Adaptation. It's time for decisions now.
We know enough about climate change. It is time for decisions now. Coping with climate change. What does that mean? Climate has always determined how we live. And when it changed in the past, we adapted. So, what's new about adapting to climate change today? Shouldn't we focus on other challenges, such as education, unemployment, and economic development? Sure enough, the climate has always been changing. But the recent change, caused by our emission of gases such as carbon dioxide and methane that increase the greenhouse effect of the atmosphere, has happened in a much shorter time frame. As a result, the Earth is warming. This change in our climate is already leading to significant impacts. Glaciers are melting faster than expected. Sea level is on the rise. And it's very likely that droughts and extreme weather events like cyclones will become more frequent. These impacts destroy people's livelihoods and homes. They damage our infrastructure and disrupt communication and trade. Moreover, climate change is endangering development successes, and the poor and marginalized are often affected the most. Okay, climate change is evidently taking place. Whether it accelerates further depends on our lifestyle and economic activities. So, is it all about reducing carbon emissions? Well, even if we were to stop emissions instantly, the world would not stop warming immediately due to the amount of gases we've already emitted. That's why we must do both: reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to inevitable climate change. But how exactly can we adapt, considering that the precise extent and form of climate change aren't known? Climate projections will never be able to predict the future with absolute certainty, partly because the way in which the climate will change depends on our decisions in coming years. But do we really need certainty to make decisions? No. We routinely make decisions based on experience, facts, or insights available to us without knowing exactly what the future will bring. And while we don't know everything about future climate change, we know enough to act. But what exactly do we need to do differently? Basically, we need to bear in mind both current and future impacts of climate change. Climate projections do not translate into concrete strategies, but they can serve as guardrails for planning. We should consider how development plans, policies, and projects might be affected by climate change, and to what extent these in turn make climate change worse. One possible consequence of climate change is precipitation pattern changes. These may lead to both droughts and extreme rain, sometimes in the same place. We should ask ourselves how a land use plan must be changed in order to remain flexible in reacting to future challenges. What adaptation measures can help to minimize effects on the local economy and people's livelihoods? Coastal megacities worldwide are threatened by the adverse consequences of sea level rise and extreme weather events. But what does an urban planner need to consider in order to make these cities climate resilient? What are the most suitable adaptation options? Clear criteria like urgency, costs, and political and social acceptance can help to prioritize adaptation options, such as flood preparedness measures, improvement of drainage systems, wetland restoration, and coastal management. Adaptation is a learning process. We all need to continuously improve our adaptation strategies, and making climate change adaptation a topic at all levels is important. There are many resources available that can support these activities, such as online information platforms like CI GRASP. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And we must start acting today, together. Involve decision makers. Increase understanding about climate change. Create awareness about the need for society to adapt. These are important first steps. Preparing for possible things to come is much better than bearing the impacts of climate change without any protection. We know enough. Now let's adapt.
Right, let's do a quick little reflection activity, shall we? With the topic of climate change, I want you to answer, put 2 dot points under each one of these things. So draw up a table like this. 2 things that you know, 2 things that you want to know. 2 things that you've learned and 2 ways that you learned them. At least 2 dot points for each of those. That's called a KWLH chart. Perhaps you've done one before. Now you're going to do another one. Thank you so much for getting stuck into today's lesson, and don't ever stop keeping it real.